The 10 plagues were not random, they were a war for the throne. A man walks into the most powerful palace in the ancient world, and he has nothing. No army, no sword, no army of soldiers waiting outside the gates. He has no political power, no wealth, no influence. He is 80 years old. His skin is darkened by decades beneath the desert sun. His sandals are cracked. His clothes carry the smell of sheep and wilderness. And in his hand, he carries a wooden stick, a shepherd's staff, the kind of stick a man uses to guide sheep away from danger. But that morning, the shepherd is not standing in front of sheep. He is standing in front of a king, Pharaoh, the man who rules Egypt, the man whose armies have conquered nations, the man whose palace is covered in gold, the man surrounded by priests, soldiers, scribes, statues, and the carved faces of gods that Egypt has worshipped for centuries. To the people of Egypt, Pharaoh is more than a king. He is divine. He is the son of the gods, the living representative of heaven on earth. And then this 80-year-old shepherd looks at him and delivers a message that should have gotten him killed. Let my people go. Imagine that moment. The silence, the old shepherd, the golden throne, the king who believes he controls everything. And then, Pharaoh says no. So God sends a plague, then another, 10 in total. Blood, frogs, insects, disease, death. Most people remember them as 10 terrible disasters. But what if that is not the real story? What if the plagues were not random? What if they were not simply disasters sent to punish a stubborn king? What if Egypt was being confronted with a question far more dangerous than that? A question that threatened the entire foundation of its civilization. Who is really in control? Because Egypt believed its gods controlled everything. The Nile, the harvest, the animals, the sky, the sun, life itself. And Pharaoh stood at the center of it all. But then something strange begins to happen. The river turns against Egypt. The land turns against Egypt. The sky turns against Egypt. The sun disappears. And slowly, one by one, everything Egypt trusted begins to collapse. So, keep your eye on the crown. Because the first 9 plagues are not the end of the story. They are a climb, a staircase. Each blow takes us higher, closer and closer to the one thing Pharaoh refuses to surrender, his throne. And by the time the 10th blow arrives, the question will no longer be whether Pharaoh can defeat Moses. The question will be whether Pharaoh can save his own house. Because the final plague will not strike a river. It will not strike frogs. It will not strike the sky. It will strike the crown itself. And when that night is over, the greatest empire in the ancient world will finally open its hand and let the slaves walk free. But before that happens, we have to go back to the river, because that is where the war begins. The first blow, the river. To understand Egypt, you have to understand the Nile. Egypt was a desert civilization. Without the Nile, there was no Egypt, no farms, no cities, no empire, no life. Every year, the river flooded, and when the waters receded, they left behind rich black soil. The Nile fed Egypt. The Nile sustained Egypt. The Nile was the heartbeat of the entire nation. And the Egyptians did not simply depend on the river. They worshipped it. They believed divine forces were behind its life-giving power. So when Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh, God does not begin with the palace. He begins with the river. Aaron raises the staff, and the water changes. The Nile becomes blood. The fish die. The water becomes undrinkable. The river that once gave life now carries the smell of death. Think about the message. Egypt's greatest source of security has become its greatest source of fear. And this is only the beginning, because then something starts crawling out of the dead river. Frogs. Not a few frogs. Thousands. Millions. They pour into the land, into the houses, into the kitchens, into the beds, into the ovens, everywhere. The Egyptians cannot escape them. And here's what makes the second plague so disturbing. In Egyptian religion, frogs were associated with fertility and life. There was a goddess, Hecate, represented with the head of a frog. The frog was connected with creation, with birth, with new life. And now, the symbol of life has become unbearable. The very thing associated with blessing has become a nightmare. But Pharaoh still refuses to surrender. So God strikes again. Moses and Aaron stand before the dust of the earth, and the dust becomes tiny biting insects. The ground itself seems to turn against Egypt. And now something changes. Pharaoh's magicians have been able to imitate some of the earlier signs. They could reproduce the appearance of blood. They could produce frogs. But now, they cannot. They try. Nothing happens. They strike the dust. They perform their rituals. They use their secret arts. Nothing. And finally, the men whose job was to explain the supernatural look at Pharaoh and admit something they never wanted to say. This is the finger of God. Think about that. The first people to recognize the true source of these signs are not Moses. They are not the Israelites. They are Pharaoh's own magicians. And they know something Pharaoh refuses to accept. This is no ordinary disaster. This is something they cannot control. And they have only seen 3 blows. There are 7 more. The line in the sand. Then comes the 4th plague. Flies. Thousands upon thousands of them. The air becomes thick. The land becomes unbearable. But suddenly, God does something different. He draws a line. Egypt is struck, but Goshen is spared. The land where the Israelites live is protected. On one side, chaos. On the other, peace. And that changes everything. Because now the Egyptians are forced to confront a terrifying truth. This is not random. A storm does not know your name. A disease does not recognize a border. A swarm does not know which house belongs to an Egyptian and which belongs to a Hebrew. But this judgment does. God is choosing. God is separating. God is showing that he is not merely stronger than Egypt. He is in control. And Pharaoh still refuses to let go. So the next blow comes. And this time, Egypt's wealth begins to die. The empire begins to collapse. The livestock die. Horses, donkeys, cattle, herds, the animals that represent Egypt's wealth and strength collapse in the fields. Then comes disease. Boils spread across the bodies of the Egyptians. The pain is everywhere. Even Pharaoh's magicians, the men who once stood confidently beside him, cannot stand before Moses. They are too sick. The people who were supposed to have answers have none. And still, Pharaoh refuses. Then the sky changes. Lightning, thunder, hail unlike anything Egypt has seen. Fire moves through the storm. Fields are destroyed. Crops are crushed. Trees are shattered. And suddenly Egypt's confidence begins to disappear. The river has been ruined. The animals are dying. The people are suffering. The fields are destroyed. But Pharaoh's heart remains hard. And this is where the story becomes more than a battle between Moses and Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh is not simply losing control of Egypt. He is losing control of himself. The Bible repeatedly describes his heart as hardened, and the more God reveals his power, the more Pharaoh refuses to surrender. He sees the evidence, he hears the warnings, he watches his nation suffer, and still, he says no. But there is a limit to how long a kingdom can survive on pride, and the 8th plague is about to prove it. The 8th blow, the harvest disappears. Locusts, they come like a living cloud, they cover the land, and they eat what the hail left behind. Every leaf, every plant, every green thing, gone. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing your entire food supply disappear. Egypt was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. But civilization depends on food. Without food, there is no empire, no army, no palace, no throne. The locusts strip Egypt down to nothing, and Pharaoh finally begins to bend. He calls Moses. He admits that he has sinned. He asks for forgiveness. For a moment, it looks like the story is over. But it isn't, because Pharaoh's repentance is temporary. As soon as the danger passes, his heart hardens again. And this is one of the most frightening things about Pharaoh. He does not lack evidence. He lacks surrender. He has seen enough. He simply refuses to bow. So God sends the 9th plague. And this one reaches higher than anything before it. The 9th blow, when the sun disappears, Moses raises his hand, and darkness falls. Not sunset, not night, darkness. A darkness so thick that the people cannot see one another. For 3 days, Egypt is trapped in blackness. No light, no movement, no escape. And now think about what has happened. The Nile has failed. The land has failed. The animals have failed. The crops have failed. The sky has failed. And now, the sun itself disappears. To Egypt, this is unthinkable. The sun was not merely an object in the sky. The sun represented divine power. The sun represented order. The sun represented life. And yet, for 3 days, Egypt cannot see it. The priests cannot restore it. Pharaoh cannot restore it. No ritual can bring it back. No army can fight it. No amount of gold can buy it. Egypt's greatest power is simply gone. But then comes the detail that should stop you. While Egypt sits in darkness, there is light where the Israelites live. Darkness here, light there. Again, a separation, a boundary, a message. And now, there is only one plague left, one final blow, one final target, and this is where you need to remember the crown. Because all this time, we have been watching the gods of Egypt fall, but there is one figure who has remained standing, Pharaoh, the living king, the man who claimed divine authority, the man who asked who is the Lord, that I should obey him. 9 plagues have come, 9 times Egypt has been shaken, and Pharaoh is still sitting on his throne. So God announces the 10th plague, and this time, the target is not the river, not the earth, not the sky, not the sun. The target is the firstborn, including Pharaoh's own son, his heir, the child who is supposed to inherit the crown, the next king, and suddenly, the entire story becomes personal, because the greatest ruler in Egypt is about to discover something terrifying. He can command an army, he can command slaves, he can command priests, he can command servants, but he cannot command death. The blood on the door, and then God gives Israel a way to escape. Not a sword, not an army, not a fortress, a lamb, one lamb for each household, and its blood is placed on the door. That night, death moves through Egypt, house after house. The cries begin, and in the greatest palace of all, Pharaoh discovers that his own power cannot save him. His son is dead, the heir to the throne is dead, the future of the dynasty is dead, and for the first time, the man who believed himself to be divine is forced to face reality. He is only a man, he cannot bring his son back, he cannot command death to leave, he cannot stop the judgment, he cannot save himself. And then, Pharaoh finally breaks. In the middle of the night, he calls for Moses and Aaron. Go, leave, take your people, take your animals, take everything, just go. And think about what has happened. The nation that once enslaved Israel is now begging them to leave. The empire that once controlled their lives is pushing them toward freedom. The slaves who had no power are walking out, and Pharaoh, the man who believed he was a god, is left standing in the ruins of his own pride. But there is something even deeper here. Because the Israelites were not saved because they were stronger. They were not saved because they had an army. They were not saved because they had better weapons. They were saved because they trusted the command of God, and because blood marked their doors. That is why the Passover became one of the defining moments of the entire Bible. A lamb, blood, a door, judgment passing over, and a people walking from slavery into freedom. The night the empire lost its gods. So what actually happened in Egypt? Was this simply a series of disasters? Or was something deeper taking place? The Bible tells us that God was judging the gods of Egypt. And whether we connect each individual plague to a specific Egyptian deity, or simply see the larger theological message, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Everything Egypt trusted failed. The river failed. The land failed. The animals failed. The harvest failed. The sky failed. The sun failed. And finally, the throne failed. That is the real tragedy of Pharaoh. He had everything: power, gold, armies, palaces, priests, gods, but none of it could save him when the moment came. Because Egypt had built its entire civilization around things it believed could never fall. And then, one by one, they fell. And perhaps that is why this ancient story still matters. Because we do the same thing, we build our lives around things we believe cannot disappear. Money, power, health, status, relationships, security, our own ability to control the future. And then sometimes, something happens, and the thing we thought was unshakable begins to move. And we ask, why is this happening? But perhaps the deeper question is, what have I been trusting? Because sometimes the things we think are holding us up are actually the things keeping us from looking up. And then there is one final image. After all the power, after all the plagues, after all the armies, after all the gods of Egypt, what was the thing that stood between a family and death? Not a sword, not an army, not a palace, a lamb, and blood on a wooden door. The most powerful empire in the ancient world could not save its own children, but the blood on a slave's doorway was enough to protect everyone inside. And the Bible never forgets that image, because the Passover was not the end of the story. It was a sign pointing forward, toward another lamb, another sacrifice, another blood, another deliverance. But that is another story. For now, remember the image of that first morning, an 80-year-old shepherd walking away from the palace, a wooden staff in his hand, behind him, a nation of former slaves, ahead of them, a desert, behind them, the greatest empire of the ancient world. And somewhere in the distance, Pharaoh's throne, still standing, but no longer feared, because the night had revealed the truth Egypt had spent centuries trying to hide. The river is not God. The sun is not God. The king is not God. The empire is not God. And no matter how powerful a man becomes, he is still only a man. 10 blows, 1 throne, and an entire empire discovering that the God they could not see was more powerful than everything they could.